Chapter 21. I had to make myself useful if I was just going to be around the house, so I let Mary Catherine sleep in and managed to feed all the children and get them to Holy Name on time. Even the principal, Sister Sheila, seemed to be happy with my performance. Believe me, that had not happened often in my life. I sometimes had the feeling that I was her white whale, the one that had gotten away. She had tried to break me as a child, and sometimes it felt like she was trying to break me as an adult. But the kids liked her. Sure, she was tough and a disciplinarian, but there was something about the way she made things run and how she treated the kids that made her almost lovable to them. The conspiracy theorist in me made me think it was just another way to get to me, make my kids love her so that it annoyed me. My grandfather was the only one I liked to share those theories with. So I decided I would. I pulled my giant Ford van around the block and parked in front of the church's administration building. As soon as I stepped in the door, a priest I didn't recognize greeted me and said, "How may I help you?" He looked to be a few years older than I was and in excellent shape. I detected a slight accent and looked past him to find my grandfather. I said, "I'm Michael Bennett, Seamus's grandson." A smile spread across the priest's face as he said, "The detective with an army of children." "That's me. Well, I'm Alonzo Garcia. I'm the new priest here." "You're the priest Seamus is mentoring?" "The very same." I blurted out, "But you're—" I managed not to say the word old aloud. A smile spread across his face as he said, "Much more handsome than you expected?" We both laughed. Father Alonzo said, "I'm new to the priesthood. The church thought a man like your grandfather who had a similar experience might be of some use." "You owned a bar too?" He chuckled. "Hardly." I was hoping for some elaboration, but I let it go. For now. I followed the priest back into the spacious offices, which had boxes stuffed in every corner. He picked up a cup of hot tea he had been brewing and set it on the desk in front of Seamus. My grandfather said, "I see you two have met." He coughed and blew his nose. Father Alonzo put a plate with a sliced orange on it in front of my grandfather before he could say anything. I liked that. We'd all been worried about Seamus's health in the past few months. He had lost weight since his heart attack, and he tended not to look after the details of his life, such as needing to drink enough fluids and eat enough fruit. We all chatted for a few minutes, and Father Alonzo invited me out to the athletic fields to look at the soccer game going on in the back. He was clearly proud of teaching some of the students at Holy Name new ways to approach the most popular team sport in the world. As soon as we were outside, he turned to me and said, "Your grandfather could be quite a stubborn man." I let out a snort. "No." Then I remembered who I was talking to. "Kidding." Father Alonzo said, "He stays up too late, doesn't get any rest during the day, and doesn't eat nearly as much as he needs to." Now we were talking as we circled the soccer field. My grandfather had come out separately from us and was on the sideline. It was a spirited and competitive game. I was impressed. I had seen a lack of enthusiasm about soccer for years here at the school. Two boys about 10 got into a shoving match after a ball had rolled out of bounds. I was impressed with Alonzo's casual intervention as he sent one boy running to the goal and the other to the opposite side of the field. Then my grandfather shouted after them in Spanish. I had never heard him speak any Spanish before, despite the fact that almost a third of the students were Hispanic. Seamus looked at me and smiled. "I showed Alonzo some of the important aspects of leading a flock, and he's been teaching me Spanish. It seemed to be working out well for the both of us." I had to agree. Chapter 22. 2 days later, at exactly 9 in the morning, I entered the office building that housed Manhattan North Homicide. It was on Broadway near 133rd Street, across the street from an elevated number 1 train. There was nothing to indicate that the building, owned by Columbia University, housed specialized units of the New York City Police Department, including homicide and intel. We sometimes joked that intelligence was where the really smart cops went, smart enough to go there so they wouldn't get in fights or be shot at. The unit was so good at its job that it often gave a heads up to the feds about changing crime trends or specific threats. Of course, that was something the FBI would never admit. I still felt tired and moved a little slowly. This was what I needed. I had to get back into the rhythm of life. It took almost 20 minutes to reach my office on the 7th floor. I was greeted by everyone from the building maintenance man to the inspector who kept his office there. A quick word and handshake or just a pat on the back made me feel comfortable, happy to be back. An officer-involved shooting touches all cops. A fallen cop reminds each of us of our mortality and that being a cop is more than just a job. I understood it was hard for the public to comprehend something like that. Most people didn't have jobs that occasionally involved someone trying to murder them. I couldn't help but look over at Antrol's empty desk. No one had touched anything. Photographs of his family still sat on the corner. It wouldn't surprise me if no one moved them for months. No one is too eager to move on after a cop dies in the line of duty. The Public Information Office of the NYPD had released Antrol's name to the media. I was simply listed as another detective who sustained injuries. I was good with that. I was also good with the fact that I had returned to work. Being busy kept my mind off things. It also made me feel like I could make a difference in the world, at least in New York City. I hadn't been at my desk 5 minutes when Harry Grissom stopped by to say hello, then asked me to follow him into his office. He closed the door behind us, then leaned on the edge of his desk when I took the chair in front of it. I had learned over the years that this was a sign he was worried about me. If he was mad, he'd sit in his chair behind the desk. But when he was concerned about a detective's state of mind, he thought leaning on a desk made the meeting feel more personal. He said, "You didn't have to rush back to work. I was out long enough. I feel fine. I got my head on straight. You don't need to worry about that." The lanky lieutenant just stared at me. He was hard to read. I was glad we never played poker. Finally, he said, "I want you to ease back into operations. Don't take on any specific cases. Take a good look at all the homicides in Manhattan and the Bronx. See if you can find any important patterns. That's the sort of thing we should do more of." I was able to suppress a smile. My lieutenant, the senior officer in my unit, was breaking the rules without saying it overtly. He was allowing me to look into the ambush that killed my partner by trying to find out if it was connected to any other homicides. He didn't say it, he couldn't, but he was giving me leeway to work in both Manhattan and the Bronx. Because a cop was involved in the shooting, Internal Affairs was working with Homicide on the case. They wouldn't want me anywhere near it. I was a witness and was too close to Antrol to ever officially be allowed to directly investigate the ambush. I took my new mandate seriously and quickly gathered all the information I could on every homicide for the past 3 months. Most of them would be considered usual. A domestic that ended with the wife stabbing the husband. An armed robbery of a jewelry store where the robber panicked and shot the 68-year-old wife of the owner. The usual series of drug killings. Nevertheless, there were a few that caught my eye. The first, of course, was the killing of the Dominican gunman who had survived our ambush. He was in the hospital and expected to make it. The cop on duty said someone tasered him, then he was immobilized with a heavy dose of tranquilizer. The details on the killer were sparse. The cop thought it was a female, but couldn't swear to it because he never saw her face. It could have been a short man. The baggy surgical scrubs and his foggy memory from the tranquilizer didn't help with his description. I also noted that someone had disabled the video surveillance at the hospital. That was not the sign of a rash and hasty killer. Chapter 23. In the afternoon, I drove south to Brooklyn. It wasn't until I was across the Brooklyn Bridge that I realized how rarely I came into this borough. The place had really seen a renaissance in recent years. This is where all the hot new restaurants were opening, and it was continuing the slow process of attracting TV and film studios. There were sound stages and great locations all over the area. Here in Brooklyn Heights, there were only a couple of the kinds of warehouses a movie studio would use. The area didn't compare to Red Hook or Gowanus, where there were plenty of warehouses that attracted trendy new businesses. I found the address that Juliana had given me and paused outside for just a minute. This didn't look like an elaborate modern soundstage. It was an old warehouse in Brooklyn Heights. No one greeted me as I entered the front door, and no one tried to keep me from walking through the corridors. I could see activity in the main room. As I walked back, a man carrying a long boom microphone nodded hello. Am I headed the right way to the set of Century's End? The chubby man hooked his hand and pointed his thumb toward the main room. I thanked him and kept walking. It may have been a small crew and there may have been no security, but the set was impressive. It looked like a popular nightclub from the 90s with a dance floor and a wraparound bar. No one was filming and most people were just milling around the set. Juliana had told me it was a drama about young people in New York during the 1990s. I wasn't sure I wanted my daughter pretending to be someone on the bar scene in the 90s. I was a young person in New York at the time. It may have been fun, but it's not what you want to think about your kids doing. I heard the familiar squeal of, "Dad!" It was an excited sound, and she was happy to see me despite her objections to a visit. I turned with my arms open to give her a hug. As she jumped up to hug me, I caught a quick glimpse of her costume, a low-cut cocktail dress. Really low-cut. I didn't know how to react. I didn't want to make her self-conscious. Unthinkingly, I slipped off my sport coat and draped it over her shoulders. She frowned at me, but kept it there. Part of me knew that I wanted everyone to see my gun and badge clearly. Sometimes it helps as a father if you're big and everyone knows you're a cop. I said, "You said you'd be finishing up soon, so I thought I might give you a ride back home. Save you the effort of riding on the subway." Juliana said, "Thanks, Dad." She took a moment to introduce me to the director. He was a little older than I was and couldn't have cared less that there was a visitor on the set. He gave me a bored nod and told Juliana to be back on set tomorrow. As we walked off the set, I was already thinking of how I would ask Mary Catherine to come by and hang out during the filming. It was the only way I would ever get some peace. Chapter 24. The next day, I sat at my desk and looked at several cases that had caught my attention. My review of homicides in Manhattan and the Bronx included the murders of 2 Canadian tourists. One had occurred before the ambush and one just after. At first glance, the 2 cases seemed unconnected, until you noticed that both men had criminal records for narcotics trafficking in Canada. That fell in line with what Brian had told me earlier about the Mexican cartel battling with a Canadian group for control of the synthetic drug market in the northeastern United States. Other sources had said the same thing. The first homicide had occurred near Times Square, and the victim was described as a tourist. My research told me he was a money man for the Canadian mob. He'd been stabbed once through the heart. According to the medical examiner's report, the wound was caused by a straight 4-inch blade. The word that stuck in my head was stiletto. No one in forensics had ever used that term. They used clinical terms like blade and instrument. I talked to the detective handling the case. I remembered him from other cases. Nice fellow, but maybe not as driven as most homicide detectives. When I got him on the phone, he said, "That was a nasty one. Coroner said she thinks the perp was a male between 5'7" and 5'10". How did she come up with that? The angle of the strike, along with the power behind it. She thinks it was someone who really knew how to use a knife or a sharpened spike. Again, I thought, stiletto. I said, "You got anything about the victim or motive?" "Yeah, the victim was just a tourist from outside Toronto. I figure he was a robbery victim." "Did you see his criminal history?" "I did. So what?" He was annoyed that someone else was snooping into his case. "Don't you think that could have played a role in the murder?" The detective said, "No, he was the victim, not the suspect." I let it go. Then I said, "According to the report, he still had his wallet and money on him when the body was found." "Yeah, so? What kind of robber goes to the trouble of killing you but doesn't bother taking your money?" The kind who gets spooked by something or didn't mean to kill the victim. How could being stabbed in the heart be an accident? I don't know, I'll tell you when we catch the robber. I knew I wouldn't get much useful information from this guy. The second homicide occurred a few blocks from Bryant Park. The victim was a known enforcer for the Canadian mob named Elaine Couche, and he had just left an Irish pub. He'd been shot twice in the face. There were no witnesses and no leads. I knew the detective on that case well. Her name was Cassandra Max, known as Cassie to her friends and Maximum Cass to anyone who got on the wrong side of her. She was as intelligent and hardworking as anyone, a rising star and considered one of the sharpest homicide investigators in the city. Her ability to speak Spanish and Creole, which she learned from her parents, made her even more valuable. When I met with her, she said, "We got nothing, but I'm still canvassing the area and seeing if we could find any security video." She flipped open a notebook. I'd say it was a professional. Someone jammed the toothpick in the car's lock. Looks like when the victim tried to open the door, the killer stepped up and shot him. I liked that no-bullshit attitude and work ethic. I'd stay in close contact with her because something would get done on this case. But even if these murders were part of a pattern, how did they fit in with the ambush that killed Antrol or the attack on Brian? Chapter 25. After my day of research and reading hundreds of reports, I decided to stop by Holy Name to check on my grandfather. As soon as I walked into the office, I could hear Seamus and his new friend, Father Alonso, debating one of the deep philosophical questions of our day, whether American football or soccer is more entertaining. My grandfather smiled when he saw me and motioned me to the seat in front of his desk. He said, "You look troubled, my boy. What's the problem?" "I'm just busy at work. I've been looking at a couple of murders connected to the drug trade. No one understands that research could be as tiring as walking a beat," Seamus said. "Can you tell us about the cases?" I gave them a quick rundown about the two Canadians and how they were killed. I left out some of the gruesome details, but they got the gist. I finished. "So it might be a long shot, but I'm working out if there's any connection to the ambush on Antrol and me. I have this feeling that all this violence is connected, including the attack on Brian." I was surprised when Father Alonso leaned forward. He said, "I don't mean to intrude on business that does not involve me, but I have seen things like this before." "Where have you seen murders like this?" "Colombia. It makes Chicago seem tame." He paused, then asked, "The murder that did not involve a gun, was it a single blow with some kind of a knife, perhaps to the heart or under the chin into the brain?" That caught me by surprise. "Yes, a single blow to the heart." "And the gunshot murder appeared to be well planned, perhaps some kind of distraction was used?" Now I was stunned. "Yes. It appears the killer broke off a toothpick in the victim's car door lock. The theory is it gave the killer enough time to stop and aim carefully." Alonzo nodded. I continued, "But I can't tie either of those murders directly to the ambush. There's nothing about either murder that lines up with the attack that killed my partner." Father Alonso said, "It's very common for Colombia contract killers to hire local muscle in certain situations, especially if the killer is from out of town. And I know many hitmen that use a sharpened stiletto whenever they can. It goes back to training they receive in Bogota by one particular martial arts instructor. Many wannabe cartel members trained there over the years. It was a badge of honor to say that that was where you obtained some of your skills. Even some police trained there." I said, "Well, that's excellent insight, Father Alonso. Do you have any other surprises?" "I'm sorry, I have been completely involved in the church for some time now. Aside from the occasional racy confession, I am completely cut off from any kind of outside vice or violence. But if you need a soccer coach, I'm your man." "And I'm sure you don't want to share how you know any of these kinds of details?" "Just observant, hoping to help." It was clear he was going to leave it at that. I kept my eyes on the fit 40-something priest with my best police stare. His brown eyes didn't leave mine. When I had more time, I had to find out how this affable priest knew so much about the drug trade. Chapter 26. It's hard to be anything but grateful when a woman like Mary Catherine greets you at the door after a long day. She gave me a kiss that would have been longer if Chrissy and Shauna hadn't run up, chattering like monkeys, waiting for their father to pick them up. I appreciated the enthusiasm and bundled both girls over my shoulder as I started to march through the apartment, greeting the older children as I went. I was impressed that Jane, Ricky, and Eddie were all studying in the dining room. Books and papers were spread across the table, and all I got was a cursory nod as each of them looked up. Bridget and Fiona were practicing some sort of stretching routine on the floor of the living room. A PBS yoga person from the 90s was giving slow, deliberate instruction on TV. A few minutes after I got home, Juliana practically skipped through the front door. Her excitement was contagious. It immediately drew Jane away from her studies. My oldest daughter squealed, "I got it! I got it!" When I looked over, I saw that she was holding something in her hand. It looked like a credit card, but I couldn't tell what kind. I dropped the little girls onto the couch and followed Mary Catherine to Juliana. She held up the card in front of me and said, "I'm official! I got my SAG card! You only get that when you're a professional actress!" Well, this was exciting news. When she held the card in front of me, I had to stare for a minute. All I could say was, "Who is Jules Baez?" Juliana gave me a sly smile and said, "That's my stage name. No two stage names could be the same." Mary Catherine said, "There was another Juliana Bennett?" "No, I just felt this was more unique. The director helped me figure it out. He said it gave me more of an edge." I had to ask, "Why do you need an edge?" "Jules Baez just sounds edgier. It's subtle, Dad. You need to be in the industry to understand things like this." I was about to respond when I felt Mary Catherine's hand on my shoulder. She had a way of gently calming me down and distracting me. We let Juliana hurry into the dining room as all the kids gathered to see her fantastic new Screen Actors Guild identification card. Mary Catherine eased me back into the living room and said, "She's excited. Let her have her moment. I know you're uncomfortable with her using a different name and wanting to be edgier, but you have to remember who she is. She's a good girl who has never given you any problems. We need to trust her judgment, at least in something like this." I nodded. My fiancée had an outstanding connection to the kids. She read them as well as any parent I had ever seen. I'd be an idiot not to listen to her. After dinner, the kids settled back into their studying routine. I was happy to see that Juliana had joined her younger brothers and sister at the dining room table. Wearing her glasses focused on algebra, she was my girl again, and I felt a wave of relief. I joined Mary Catherine on the balcony and we looked out toward the river. She leaned her head against my shoulder and said, "I hope you realize what a good dad you are." I thought about Brian. I've made some mistakes. Well, isn't that what we humans are supposed to do? She never failed to make me feel better when I was a little troubled. I kissed her on the top of her head and said, "Have you given any thought to a date for our wedding?" She turned and gave me a smile. Then there was a squeal inside the apartment. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual sounds of kids. Mary Catherine turned from the railing and said, "What on earth?" Then she hurried inside without answering my question. I took a few moments to be alone on the balcony. Chapter 27. Alex Martinez drove her Chevy Silverado pickup truck from the parking garage near the El Dorado Airport in the northern section of Bogota, all the way to her ranch outside the smaller town of Melgar, about 2.5 hours to the southwest. She could smell some of the animals at the Zoologico Café Melgar as she passed by. The simple municipal zoo carried a much different odor from her ranch. She attributed some of the smell to the presence of primates. Whereas she appreciated the smell of a horse, a primate was just a little too close to human. Alex could barely contain the excitement she felt about returning home. All the major cities, New York, Paris, Mexico City, were just too crowded. The more time she spent in these places, the less human she felt. The front gate to the ranch was open. They were expecting her. She waved from the truck without slowing down as the families in the first two houses stepped outside to wave to her. She found a way to employ both husbands and both wives as well as provide an education for all 6 of the children. Sometimes it wasn't easy. A mile later, she slowed down in front of the main house. She could see the broad shape of her housekeeper, Maria, and her rail-thin husband, who handled all the maintenance around the house. Right next to them were the 2 people she really wanted to see. She slipped out of the pickup truck and her feet had not even touched the ground when tiny arms wrapped around her waist to give her a hug. She dropped to her knees to embrace both her daughters at once. Clemency was 6 and liked to conduct herself with some dignity. Her neatly brushed hair hung straight back as usual. Her little sister, Gabriella, who was just turning 4, had her usual disheveled look, which warmed the heart of every adult she met. Alex just took a moment and got lost in the emotion of her 2 girls hugging her. Every time she left, she felt she had been gone too long. She walked toward the house with the girl hanging on to each hand. She wanted to hear everything that had happened and all that they had learned. Maria embraced Alex and kissed her on the cheek as if she were her own daughter. Maria's husband gave a stately bow. The older man had spent many years in the military before being forced out under suspicion of being associated with a drug cartel. She asked him about it once. He laughed and said, "If I worked with a drug cartel, would I be fixing your toilets now?" The other 6 men and women who worked in the stables near the house kept their distance, but gave Alex a polite wave. She was home, and she felt it. She didn't think anything could dampen her mood. As soon as Alex was inside and the girls were dutifully running one of her bags into her bedroom, she felt her phone vibrate. When she looked down at the text message, she immediately recognized the number. It was her contact with the Mexican drug cartel. The text message was simple and to the point. Michael Bennett is alive. Chapter 28. Alex Martinez understood how much she missed her daughters when she was away. Today she was getting an idea of how much Gabriella and Clemency had missed her. They were ready to ride, each in her own style. Clemency wore everything perfectly. English riding boots halfway up her calves, her riding pants tucked neatly into the boots. And Gabriella looked just like an outlaw from a 1950s movie, right down to the red bandana tied around her neck. Her wild dark hair poked out from underneath the tiny Stetson. Alex helped the girls saddle their own horses. She wanted them to be self-sufficient, as well as understand how to keep the horses calm and healthy. She showed Gabriella the proper way to ease the bit into the horse's mouth. The little girl focused on the lesson completely. Clemency lately had favored a colt named Samuel. Alex didn't think her daughter got the joke that someone had named the horse after the famous gun manufacturer Samuel Colt. Gabriella had recently been riding a pony named Biscuit. Alex could see why. The little horse had a wild mane and was full of energy. They were made for each other. When Alex was growing up, her British riding instructor had always referred to horses like Biscuit as a Welsh cob. That was not a term you heard frequently in Colombia. Out of respect for the man who was very important during her formative years, Alex still called Biscuit a Welsh cob. As much as she relaxed at times like this, she always stayed aware of her surroundings, conscious of how many enemies an assassin makes during his or her career. Her 9mm Beretta hung in a bag from her saddle, always within easy reach, one of the habits she had picked up since she stumbled into her profession as a young college grad. The girl's father, Raphael, never agreed with her choice of jobs. That might have helped push him out the door to shack up with the cruise ship dancer. The girls got postcards from all over the world now, but rarely saw their shiftless father, who lived off a trust fund. Gabriella giggled, which made Alex twist in the saddle to see what her daughter found so amusing. Biscuit was sniffing the hindquarters of Clemency's colt, Samuel. Alex looked ahead again to hide her smile. Clemency trotted up, and then had to fight to control Samuel. Alex said, "You're doing great, Clemmy, but think of you and Samuel as one. You're part of him, and he's part of you. Let him feel your confidence." Clemency nodded, and immediately tried a quick turn and sprint, her long, dark ponytail flowing behind her. Now Gabriella caught up to her mother. "How am I doing, Mama?" "Wonderful, baby. You and Biscuit are perfect together." Alex was distracted by another rider coming from the direction of the ranch. She tensed and unbuckled the pouch holding her pistol. Then she recognized the rider and called out, "Manny!" Her slim 33-year-old cousin smiled as he approached. Alex leaned over and kissed him. He said, "You look beautiful, as always." The girls both raced up to greet her cousin, whom they called Uncle Manny. Manny said, "I propose a race. Your mama and me to the far hill and back. You two will be the referees in case she tries anything funny." Alex didn't wait for a signal. She urged Mitzi into a full gallop, and Manny fell in behind her immediately. Manny rode a gelding from her stable named Reynaldo. The horse was big, more than 15 hands high, but he had a smooth gait. Alex looked ahead slightly, avoiding gopher holes and other dangers to a galloping horse. She urged Mitzi on with a nudge from her feet. She'd never used a whip or spurs in her whole life. Manny matched her step for step, kicking Reynaldo harder, but nothing more. Reynaldo had the stride, but Alex had the experience. Alex circled the oak tree at the crest of the hill. She looked up to see the girls cheering about 400 meters ahead. Sweat was dripping into her eyes, and she felt her legs tiring under the stress of riding and standing up slightly in the stirrups. Alex hated to lose, especially to her cousin Manny. Alex smiled at the girls' squeals as she crossed the finish line ahead of Manny. They both eased the horses to a trot, then returned to the giddy girls. Manny said, "Once again, your beautiful mother has demonstrated to you that women can compete with men anywhere." Alex beamed at the victory and the girls' excitement. After a few minutes, they sent the girls ahead so they could talk about their shared profession. Alex said, "Any interesting jobs coming up?" Manny shook his head. "I'm taking a break. I was almost caught by the Brazilian National Police after I completed a contract in Rio. Some oil company executive hired me to deal with one of his rivals. The job itself wasn't that hard, but any time you take a contract not related to the drug business, the police tend to take notice. I barely made it back here without having to explain why I put 2 bullets in the back of the man's head." Manny looked at her, no humor in his tone. "I've heard about your New York contracts. People in the United States don't like it when cops are killed. It's not like Mexico, where a payoff will keep people quiet. In the States, they'll do everything they can to find you. You've got the girls, this ranch, all those people you take care of. I've only got me. And your mother?" "Okay, but no children." Alex sighed. "What can you do? It's the business. I prefer to stay here with the girls." "I would prefer that as well. Let me finish the contract." She laughed. "Always trying to protect me. I appreciate it, Manny. But I can complete any contract you can. Besides, there are still a couple of Canadians in New York I need to deal with as well." "When do you leave?" Alex said, "Tomorrow I'm meeting with my liaison to the cartel. I'll see what he has to say before I make any decisions." Manny laughed and said, "That is so you. No decision, no matter how small, is ever taken lightly." "I wish I had your discipline." Alex sighed. "No, you don't." Chapter 29. I got home in the evening just before dinner. I was beat. I guess I wasn't as fully recovered as I thought, just like everyone from Mary Catherine to the doctors had told me. And oddly, I still had a hard time admitting I was stubborn. The younger kids each darted into the hallway to greet me, as they always did. I doled out hugs and kisses that immediately wiped away my exhaustion. The older kids gave me courtesy nods, and Ricky even said, "Hey, Dad." Dinner smelled like a traditional Irish roast with maybe a splash of spices from Ricky. As I stepped into the dining room, ready to greet Mary Catherine, I was surprised to see the athletic form of Father Alonso helping to move some glasses into the living room. "Hello, Michael. I hope you don't mind that your grandfather brought me along for dinner." "Oh, of course not. In a family this size, one more person is barely noticed." Just then, Chrissy ran up with our cat in her arms. "Something's wrong with Saki." I took a closer look. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Shauna and Trent joined the medical consultation. Chrissy was hesitant. I asked, "What is it?" "It's Saki's, butt." I checked, and sure enough, there was a piece of string poking out slightly. I leapt into action. I looked at Trent and said in a mock official tone, "Find me an open operating table with newspaper covering it." My son sprang to attention and called, "Yes, sir." He gave me a quick smile and wink. Trent led me into the living room where he had cleared the coffee table and spread newspaper over it. He helped me hold Saki, who seemed to like the attention, as I conducted a thorough examination. Eddie joined us out of curiosity as the girls knelt down to comfort the cat. I used a napkin to grasp the string and pull. The foot-long string slid out easily, although afterwards Saki squirmed free and fled. I held up the string and said to the girls, "Voila! The operation was successful." Mary Catherine stepped into the living room and said, "Quit acting like a child in front of our guest." Then she saw the string I was holding and said, "Oh, I wondered where the pork loin string went last night." I smiled and said, "I hope you're not going to use it again." I was rewarded with a hail of laughter from the girls. Father Alonso laughed too and said, "You're a lucky man to spread such joy." I smiled. He was right. As dinner simmered and the children cleared their homework off the dining room table, I joined Seamus and Alonso on the balcony. Both priests sipped on glasses of red wine, and Seamus passed one to me. I accepted and brought it to my nose, hoping it wasn't my talisman Weir Vineyard Pinot Noir. $60 was a lot for a cop to shell out for wine. I'd been saving it for a special occasion. Alonso was perceptive. He said, "I hope you like the wine. I took it from the communion box at Holy Name." I just stared at him for a moment, speechless. Alonso said, "I'm sorry, just a poor joke. We picked it up at the liquor store down the street." I wasn't used to a priest with a normal sense of humor. We chatted for a few more minutes. Alonso complimented me on how well-behaved the children were. It's hard not to like someone who compliments your children. I tried to get a little more of his background. He was raised in Bogota, educated in Mexico City. Alonso said, "I had quite a full life before God set me on the right path. I'm trying to use my experience in a different way, dealing with everyday people." "What motivated you to join the church?" Now Seamus interrupted. "Michael, my boy, those aren't the kinds of questions we ask people who've come into the church. No one cares that I used to own a bar." I said, "No one would know if you didn't tell people every 10 minutes. Before he could answer with a sarcastic comment, Juliana stepped into the room and said, "Mary Catherine says dinner will be ready in about 10 minutes. Father Alonso greeted Juliana and tried to make conversation, asking her, "Have you given any thought about where you want to go to college?" She avoided looking at me when she answered, "I have a lot of options on the table right now. I'll start to narrow them down near Christmas." She backed out of the room before I could comment. Alonso tried again, asking me, "So have you and Mary Catherine picked a date?" I looked down at the tile and just shook my head. "You ever been married, Alonso? I mean, before your marriage to the church?" He said, "I was engaged once." "What happened?" "The usual. Who knows? There are thousands of possible answers. The easiest explanation is that she fell in love with another man, a man who could provide her with things I couldn't. But now I have the church." Seamus clapped him on the shoulder and said, "And you've got me." Alonso smiled and said, "Oh, joy." That was the hardest I had laughed in months. Chapter 30. The next day at the office, I wasted no time walking up to Harry Grissom and telling him some of what I had deduced about the string of killings. These weren't business-as-usual drug rip-offs and grocery store robberies. There was a pattern to it. I just hadn't figured out what the pattern was. I needed to keep digging and wanted Grissom's blessing to start rummaging through old homicide cases. He pulled me over to a corner near a window where no one in the squad bay would hear us. Then he looked at me with those droopy eyes and said, "What have you got?" I'd known this hardened cop for too long not to come right to the point. I think the ambush was part of a bigger drug war that's going on. I don't know why anyone would want me or Antrol dead, but the way our original suspect was murdered and the tip that came into us makes it look like it was a setup from the very beginning. Grissom just nodded as he considered it. I've also found 2 murders of Canadian nationals here in the city in the last week. Both victims had a past involving narcotics and were known to be associated with the Canadian mob. I have intel from a couple of sources that says the Canadians are clashing with the Mexican cartel over control of the synthetic drug market. The lieutenant interrupted me. Are you saying there's a drug war involving Canadians? Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. That will be one of the quietest, most polite drug wars in history. He took a moment to think, then said, You can keep on your assignment trying to discover patterns in these homicides, but I don't want you to start coming up with crazy conspiracy theories. You know as well as I do that the majority of the murders in New York are somehow related to drugs. I want to find Antrol's killer just as badly as you do, but I don't want you raising such a fuss that someone asks why you aren't assigned any current homicides. Is that clear? Crystal. Then I expect you to get on with your assignment. If that assignment happens to lead to viable suspects in Antrol's murder, then everyone is happy. If not, I wasted my best detective on a foolish assignment. I've been accused of worse. I watched Grissom as he padded back to his office. I often wondered if he tried to be inspiring or just had a way about him that pushed you to your limits. Suddenly I felt energy. I needed to line up some leads and feel like I was doing something. That's how a cop should always feel. Chapter 31. Alex enjoyed the ride from the ranch up to Bogota. She and the girls sang songs, then played silly games like I Spy and I'm Thinking of an Animal. That was Gabriella's favorite game because she loved animals and it was just 20 yes or no questions. Her sister was nice and usually picked a simple animal that Gabby could identify. Alex's mother laid a guilt trip on her about being away so much. Alex didn't bring up the fact that she worked hard to pay the bills, which included her mother's comfortable condo in the suburbs of Bogota. It was all just a prelude for what the real purpose of the day was. She left the girls at her mother's condo for an hour and drove to Alcalá Park, between the highway and 19th Road. It was a quiet park with enough trees to make finding a shady spot to sit easy. It also wasn't a particularly busy park during the week. As soon as she entered the park, she saw the man she needed to speak to sitting on a bench as far away from the parking lot as possible. She casually strolled toward him so she wouldn't draw attention to herself, and to let the man know she was in no hurry. He had an inflated view of himself. Many men in his position did. Alex walked past him, feeling his eyes all over her, then sat on the far end of the bench. She didn't say anything. He was a well-dressed, extremely handsome 35-year-old with a trim body. His Tommy Hilfiger shirt was clearly his attempt to look casual, but he looked like someone out of a catalog. She would have used him in an ad that called for a father and son. The man simply said, "Alex, nice to see you. I occasionally forget that you could be a model as well as a photographer." She took a moment and said, "What brings you all the way from Mexico City?" "Business, always business. As long as Colombia controls the transportation and access to our product, I will make a dozen trips a year to your lovely country." Alex couldn't get a sense of what Oscar was thinking. She suspected he was annoyed that she had not completed her contracts in New York, but he showed no sign of it. A wealthy man like him, who enjoyed getting his hands dirty occasionally, knew how to hide his emotions. Finally, Oscar said, "Some of the Canadians on your list are back in New York, and Detective Michael Bennett is alive. I believe my text to you covered that fully." "Yes, and I've considered the contract carefully. Isn't it dangerous for your operation to kill a New York City detective? This has more of a personal element in it. Such as, does it matter? You've already been paid half up front to eliminate him. You need a reason to collect the other half?" Alex gave him a careful smile. "I was just curious. It won't be an easy job to complete. Bennett has proved quite resourceful." Oscar slowly bobbed his head. Oh, don't get me wrong. I agree with you, but I am only a cog in a big organization. I am the liaison to you and several others. But I heard from some of my associates that Detective Bennett shot and killed a young man in a library not too long ago. Well, sometimes police have to do things like that. But this young man worked for us. His mother is related to someone higher up in the cartel. Apparently, she asked for us to deal with the cop who shot her son, Diego. It's really a matter of honor. But none of that should concern you. All you need to worry about is that Bennett needs to die. The sooner, the better. I agree. I will head back to New York in a few days. I'm still in contact with some of the Dominicans I used for the ambush. Did they prove reliable enough for you to use them again? They screwed up the first time, but they have a certain reputation to uphold as well. Besides, they're expendable. That's why I pay them so well. Oscar smoothed his dark hair and said, That's funny. That's the same way we feel about you. Chapter 32. So far, I wasn't impressed with Juliana's new career. It felt like my daughter was using it as an excuse to distance herself from the family. Her stage name was only part of the puzzle. She was spending a lot less time at home and barely spoke when she was there. I took another ride into Brooklyn and strolled onto the set. The cameraman nodded to me as I walked past. Although no one had paid me any attention the first time I visited, it was clear that everyone knew who I was. I kept my sport coat on, covering my pistol this time. There was no sense in being obnoxious. I saw a chair with a sign that said Jules Baez. It made me cringe, but there was nothing I could do about it. I heard a loud voice yell, "Quiet on the set!" Someone else made another announcement, then slammed the handle down on a board, indicating what scene they were working on. It was just like I had seen in movies. Even for me, it was kind of exciting. Then I saw my little girl turn toward a tall, handsome young man. 2 cameras were close to them as they filmed what looked to be a tender scene. Now that I saw how professional the production was, despite the cheesy studio, I felt better. I watched as Juliana and the young man did a quiet scene where he told her about his dream to be on Broadway. This was not a show I'd watch if my daughter wasn't in it. The scene ended. The director yelled, "Cut! That was perfect!" Someone else called for the set to be changed, and I watched Juliana as she walked toward me with the young man. "Hey, Dad." She gave me a mechanical hug. I took a breath and said, "You look great up there, sweetheart." That brought out a big smile. Juliana said, "Dad, this is Cade." The young man stuck out his hand and gave me a firm handshake as he looked me in the eye and said, "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Bennett." "So you know Juliana's real name?" "Oh, yes, sir. My real name is Carter Javits, but around here I'm Cade Jason. I'm trying to go by that all the time now." "Oh, your parents must be very happy." Juliana cut in, "I have to get my stuff." She looked up at Cade and said, "I'll see you later tonight." I said, "What's going on tonight?" "Cade is taking me out to dinner." She wandered off to gather her purse and school clothes. I decided it was time to get to know this young man. "Is this your first acting job?" Cade said, "No, sir. I've had a few bit parts here and there since I graduated 3 years ago." "What high school did you graduate from?" "I graduated from Stony Brook University 3 years ago with my degree in communications." Like any father, I did the math in my head quickly. He had to be 25 or 26. I played it cool. "Would you like to eat with us tonight, Carter? Cade?" Juliana saved him. "Thanks, Dad, but we've already set up our plans." With that, I was served notice that my daughter had grown up. Chapter 33. Alex Martinez took Avianca Flight 244 directly from Bogota to New York. It was a flight known for being watched by the DEA. But now that drugs came in by the truckload across the border, the flight had lost some of its mystique. That night, Alex wasted no time checking into an older, funky hotel she liked, the Skyline Hotel on West 49th. There was something about the retro feel of the place that gave it charm, and the hotel had a decent indoor pool. In the morning, Alex immediately started researching her next target. Alicia Toussaint was an attractive, middle-aged Canadian woman who financed much of the violence the Canadian mob used to keep people in line. She was here in New York gauging her organization's efforts to control the synthetic drug market. Alex preferred not to take contracts on women, but she felt that if a woman was in some kind of nasty trade like drugs, then all bets were off. Alex knew that no one would show her mercy if she was ever targeted because of her job. After only a short time conducting surveillance on the woman, Alex discovered that Miss Toussaint had a security man who stayed well out of the way and out of sight. It was the mark of a true professional, not drawing any extra attention to herself. Alex first noticed the man when she started following the Canadian from her hotel. She appreciated her choice of the Hotel Giraffe on Park Avenue South and 26th, which was under the radar but boasted a good restaurant and comfortable atmosphere. The man was dressed in casual clothes, his loose shirt probably covering some kind of weapon. He was in his mid-40s and had a little extra weight on him. He wasn't there to scare people. He'd been chosen because he was discreet and knew his business. Alex wouldn't take any chances when the time came. Alex knew the hotel and the area well. It would be difficult to get into the woman's room at the Giraffe. That meant she had to find a spot in the open to do it. Rarely a good idea in New York City. She conducted the rest of her surveillance a little farther back than she normally would, to keep both the bodyguard and Alicia Toussaint in view. The Canadian seemed to have hourly meetings. She was a hard worker. Alex admired that. They were all short face-to-face meetings with white or Hispanic men. Alex didn't care what each meeting was about, because sometime after sunset tonight, any agreement struck will be null and void. That's how things worked in the narcotics business. Later in the day, Alex followed while Miss Toussaint strolled down Fifth Avenue. Alex had enough photographs of her to create a pretty good biography and pictures. It was the necessary preparation for any assignment. Only once did Miss Toussaint have any contact with her bodyguard. She bought something small from a jewelry store, then turned and walked directly to him. He stuck whatever she had bought in his left front pants pocket. Alex noticed that the sun was setting and some of the city lights were slowly coming on. Her target turned and started to stroll back toward the Hotel Giraffe. Alex fell in behind the bodyguard. She had both her stiletto and her 9mm pistol in her Vera Wang purse, which had a strap that slipped over her shoulder comfortably. She was as ready as she would ever be. First, she had to deal with the bodyguard. Chapter 34. On the walk back to the hotel, Alex formed a plan in her head. It was tricky because there were two targets, though she was only getting paid for one. She would have preferred to kill Alicia Toussaint without having to deal with the bodyguard, but killing him too was just a good business decision. Then she saw an opportunity she couldn't resist. Her target, Alicia Toussaint, strolled into Madison Square Park. She stopped and sat on an ornate cement bench. She pulled out an iPhone and relaxed on the bench. It looked like she'd be there a while. Immediately, Alex changed her plan and started to ease up behind the bodyguard, who was standing behind a chest-high wall at the edge of an intricate water fountain. Alex glanced around and realized the park was relatively quiet. The bodyguard gazed up at the Flatiron Building in the distance. Then he returned his gaze to his employer. It almost looked as if he was spying on someone from the bushes. He was just being professional and maintaining his surveillance of the entire area. That was his mistake. He never even noticed Alex as she came up behind him with her stiletto already extended. Just as she stepped up next to the bodyguard, he turned, giving her the opening she needed. She shifted her weight and drove the stiletto straight up under the man's jaw so that the sharpened steel crashed through his mouth and nasal cavity, then directly into his brain. Alex would call his expression confused. He didn't understand what had happened or why he couldn't move. His eyes focused briefly on her, and he gurgled a question for a moment. Then she moved her left arm behind him and eased him carefully to the ground. He was now just a sack of bones and skin. Against the wall, with the bushes near him, his body was barely visible. Alex ran her hands over his waistline and found a Browning 9mm pistol in his waistband. She slipped it into her purse. Just as Alex was about to leave the body, she reached down into his left front pants pocket and retrieved the tiny box that his boss, Alicia, had given him earlier. She opened it and found a pair of beautiful pear-shaped diamond earrings. They were at least 2 carats. They were remarkable. For a moment, Alex wished she were a thief instead of a killer. She slipped the earrings back into the man's pocket. When Alex stood up and peeked over the wall, she could see Miss Toussaint still sitting in front of the fountain. Maybe this wouldn't be as hard as she thought. Chapter 35. Alex was polite and waited until her target completed her phone call. When the woman slipped the iPhone back into her purse, Alex calmly walked toward her and sat down on the same bench. Alex said, "Hello, Miss Toussaint." That got the woman's full attention. She turned her pretty face, framed by light brown hair, and focused on Alex. She said, "Do I know you, dear?" She had a slight French accent. Alex said, "No, I'm not someone you would normally do business with." "But you do work for someone. That means you're not here for a friendly conversation." The woman looked over Alex's shoulder toward the wall where her bodyguard had been waiting. Alex calmly pulled the man's 9mm pistol from her purse and said, "If you're waiting for the man who owns this to come to your rescue, you'll be in for a surprise." The Canadian remained calm and said, "Are you going to just shoot me? No warnings or attempt to find out information?" "I'm afraid not." Before Alex could say anything, the Canadian financier swung her left hand, knocking the pistol away, and came back with the right elbow that caught Alex low on the chin. The blow knocked her off balance and almost completely off the bench. She twisted into a crouch as she slid off the bench to face the Canadian woman. The Canadian threw a knee just as Alex looked up from her crouch. She was able to move, and the knee just grazed the side of her head. She had underestimated her target. The Canadian didn't waste any time throwing another kick, then pulling a straight razor from God knows where. She whipped it at Alex's face. Alex felt the blade just miss her nose as she jumped back. That thin blade would have sliced her nose in half. She desperately tried to regain her balance before the Canadian disfigured her, or worse. A police siren blasting in the distance distracted them both for a moment. As soon as Alex realized it was a block away, she hopped back and raised the pistol. Just as her target advanced with the razor poised for another strike, she pulled the trigger. Without a silencer, the shot sounded like a cannon, but the echo would make it hard to tell exactly where the shot came from. The bullet struck the woman just above the bridge of her nose. She crumpled straight to the ground right in front of Alex. Instead of checking the body, which was perfectly still on the hard concrete next to the fountain, Alex looked up to make sure no one was rushing toward her. Alex backed away from the body, then turned and walked quickly away. The few people on the edges of the park paid no attention to her. Alex kept moving onto Broadway. She looked straight ahead as she passed the Flatiron Building and continued. She turned right on 21st, looking around quickly. She pulled out the Browning pistol she had used to kill the Canadian financier and tossed it into the back of an idling garbage truck just before it rumbled away from the curb. Thank God for lucky opportunities. Alex worked to control her breathing and made sure her jaw wasn't broken. It was sore, but intact. If nothing else, it would confuse the cops for a while that there were 2 bodies at the same scene, killed by different methods. She started to smile, thinking about the detectives who would have to figure that puzzle out. Chapter 36. I finally decided that if I wanted to understand murders associated with the drug trade, I needed to understand the drug trade a little better. My best contact in the NYPD narcotics unit was a sergeant stationed right in my building. Sergeant Tim Marcia was a few years older than I was, and no one would mistake him for anything but a cop. At 6'1" and beefy, he'd kept the same mustache since the mid-1990s. He was about as straight a shooter as anyone would ever meet, and he understood the drug world better than anyone else. I sat in the passenger seat of his seized Range Rover. The narcotics unit often used cars it seized from drug dealers to conduct surveillance or undercover operations. We drove up into the Bronx so Sergeant Marcia could talk to a couple of his informants. He treated them more like he was a big brother or a mentor than a cop. I like that. Near Yankee Stadium, I sat in the Range Rover while he chatted with a young Puerto Rican man just outside the SUV. Sergeant Marcia said, "You sure that's it? You haven't heard any other rumors?" The thin young man shook his head and mumbled, "No, nothing at all." Sergeant Marcia put a playful headlock on the young man, then said, "Don't be late for class, and don't make your mother worry about you tonight. Be home by 10. The young man smiled and waved as he walked off. When Sergeant Marcia slipped back into the car, I said, "That's not exactly how the movies portray your job. Everyone has his own style. I never pretended to be Popeye Doyle from the French Connection. I would rather fix a few lives while making a case than run a big operation that disrupts an entire neighborhood." I couldn't agree more. What did your young friend have to say? He said there's been a disruption of the synthetic drug market. Everyone was making a fortune on ecstasy and meth, and now they're back to selling pot and coke. My snitch says there's been some Canadians trying to dump extra meth on the market, but the Mexican cartel has told people to steer clear. I said, "Sounds like my son Brian got the straight scoop." I wouldn't have chosen these circumstances, but I'd been grateful to see Brian in the Buffalo hospital at least twice a week. Sergeant Marcia said, "I don't want to admit that a homicide puke came up with an explanation for what's going on in the narcotics trade. This is embarrassing. Will you help me find this killer and I'll never tell a soul?" Sergeant Marcia laughed. "If we go back too far, I have too much on you. You won't tell a soul no matter what happens." "But you'll help me just the same?" "I'm insulted you even have to ask. We'll figure this out, and I'll write an official report saying that we got the original information from Brian. Maybe we can use that as a way of showing the court how much he's cooperated. Who knows? Maybe we can cut that crazy sentence down a little bit." That was the mark of a true friend. Sergeant Marcia said, "Synthetics are a part of the drug trade I don't have a lot to do with. All my experience is with heroin and cocaine. I can predict what those users and dealers will act like. The synthetic drugs like ecstasy attract a new kind of seller and affects all users differently. I knew the Canadians were heavily involved in that market, but they tend to stay under the radar, and we haven't made any serious arrests. It's just semantics when we're talking about drugs. People are going to use them whether they're in the form of prescription pills or black tar heroin. Sometimes I feel we should just legalize all drugs and take the consequences." "What kind of consequences?" "A surge in overdose deaths, a much higher percentage of the population that doesn't contribute anything to society, a bunch of drug dealers looking for a different crime they could commit because the government has taken over their jobs. Who could tell what would happen? I don't even like to think about it." Listening to the narcotics sergeant, I remembered an old-timer advice talking about how the Dutch handled some of their crime problems. He had said, the Dutch had a problem with prostitution, so they legalized it. Then they had a problem with drugs, so they legalized them. Let's hope they never have a problem with homicide. Chapter 37. Alex reached a few conclusions after her first day following Michael Bennett. The detective was as busy as any man who ever lived. Between work and a huge family, Alex wondered when the man slept. She would probably not use her stiletto unless she could catch him by surprise, because he was tough and in shape. A gun would be the safest avenue. That was why she was meeting with these two Dominicans at a White Castle off Webster Avenue in the Bronx. She would have preferred a busy Starbucks in Midtown, but she understood what they were doing. They wanted to meet her on their turf. Alex sipped a coffee while the men worked their way through a plate piled high with tiny hamburgers. They spoke in Spanish, but in this neighborhood, that wasn't any shield against someone listening in. Their Dominican accents were a little difficult for Alex to understand, but she had explained who the target was and where they might intercept him. Then she said, I want just the two of you involved. The fewer the better. The older, pudgier man with tattoos running up and down his arms said, We'll need a driver. My cousin Julio will do it, but... Alex was losing her patience. What? What's wrong now? The man said, A cop is a big deal. We took the job before, but now it's going to be a second cop. That's heat building. You told me your crew was the toughest in the city, that any of your men would die rather than be dishonored and not finish a job. I already paid you a lot of cash up front. The man interrupted her. And we have 3 men dead because of it. That's not my issue. That's why I hired you as contractors. What about Cesar, who was killed in the hospital? Did you do that so he wouldn't talk? Alex had lost her cool. She snapped. Give me back the money. What, I don't have it just lying around? Well, if you're not going to give it back, do your job. Do what I tell you, or I'll make sure no one ever hires you or any of your crew again. Is that what you want? The younger man started to say something, a vein on his forehead popping out. But the man with the tattoos put a hand on his chest. We'll do it, and we'll expect you to come up with the rest of the cash quickly when it's done. Then we'll be square, at least as far as money is concerned. What's that supposed to mean? We have some questions we'd like answered after we get paid. Once I close out my contracts and you've done what you've been paid to do, I'll talk with you all you want. The man picked up a tiny hamburger and popped it into his mouth. He washed it down with a big gulp of soda. Then he looked at Alex and said, You'll have me, Laszlo here, and my cousin Julio whenever you need us. Alex eyed Laszlo. He was the surly, emotional type that made this job miserable sometimes. She hoped his older friend could keep him in line. Chapter 38. After meeting with the Dominicans, Alex used the entire afternoon to gather more information on Bennett. By following him to meet his grandfather, who she learned was a priest, she had the opportunity to photograph the churches in the neighborhood where Bennett lived and his grandfather worked. She loved the architecture of churches and relished the opportunity to mix pleasure with business. Late in the afternoon, when she was tired of waiting for Bennett to emerge, Alex strolled into Central Park. She eyed a cop on horseback who was checking her out, then was distracted by a group of tourists riding horses with a guide. Horses, right in Central Park. Clemency and Gabriella could ride better than any of these adults, Alex thought. She knelt down and snapped 6 quick photos of the group with the sun casting wild beams of light through the trees. It was a wonderful sight. Then she heard a man's voice say, Are you a spy conducting surveillance or just a fan of horses? The voice startled her, and she turned quickly, rising to her feet. She stared for a moment. It was the policeman sitting atop his bay horse, more than 16 hands tall. The horse's placid eyes took her in. Alex said, Excuse me? I said, are you a spy or just into horses? Both. She hated to lie. It was hard for a man not to look sexy on top of a horse, but this policeman also had broad shoulders and a square jaw. He looked like a recruiting poster. He gave her a smile, showing his perfect white teeth. Alex felt herself flush slightly. She liked the way his eyes stayed on her face. It showed a good upbringing. She stepped closer to him and ran her hand along the horse's graceful neck. What's his name? Traveler. Just like Robert E. Lee's horse. The cop stared at her, then said, Well, that's exactly right. Almost no one gets that. I bet the horse people do. The horse people and the Civil War nuts. On impulse, she said, How do I rent a horse here? You know how to ride? I've been around horses my entire life. The cop said, What do racehorses eat? Alex smiled. Well, that's the oldest joke around. Fast food. Okay, that's one. What goes in the horse's mouth? The bit. She tried to look insulted, but this guy was too adorable. The cop said, Finally, the most important question. Will you go out with me? She couldn't help but laugh. Let's see how the ride goes. Fair enough. Suddenly, not only Alex's day, but also her whole trip started to look brighter. The cop's name was Tom McLaughlin, but his friends called him T-Mac. He'd been raised in Quantico, Virginia, where his father was stationed in the Marines. That's where he developed his love of horseback riding. Alex couldn't remember the last time she actually enjoyed herself this much on an assignment. Time flew while they rode through the park. Alex said, "Is it hard to get an assignment in the NYPD horse unit?" "It's called the Mounted Unit, and you'd be shocked how many cops want to get in. There's only about 55 horses now. We go all over the city for PR and sometimes crowd control. We also patrol the park. I love it, except I never get weekends off." He had a simple, direct way about him, and Alex found him interesting. When he asked for her phone number, she gave him the number to her burner phone, which would be good for the length of her stay in New York, a stay she hoped would be long enough to see this handsome cop again. She said, "I'll only be in New York another week or so, but I would enjoy a nice dinner. Steak and horses are two of my favorite things." T-Mac gave her a dazzling smile and said, "Mine too." Chapter 39. I got the call about a double homicide down in Madison Square Park around 9 o'clock. Mary Catherine understood that I had a certain duty no matter what time of day or night I was called. She just reminded me to take it easy, since I was still recovering from my injuries. There's a certain zen to doing the job you're trained for and understand so well. I even had a twinge of excitement as I hopped in my city car and headed south. This time of night, I made it to the crime scene pretty quick. Sometimes I forget about the turnover in the NYPD. I didn't recognize a single one of the young uniformed officers maintaining the perimeter of the crime scene. It was at the lower end of the park near a massive water fountain. I had my ID and a badge on a chain around my neck. I didn't wear a jacket, so everyone saw the second badge clipped next to my gun on my belt. As I approached the fountain, I saw exactly who I was looking for. Cassie Max was on one knee by the edge of the fountain, looking back toward some bushes and a low wall. Her short black hair was covered by a scarf as she focused her attention on the far side of the fountain. As soon as she saw me, a smile whipped across her face and she sprang to her feet. Cassie said, "It's nice to see that senior detectives still come out after dark." When I was younger, the word senior was code for old. Nothing's changed. She gave me a sly smile that conveyed her wit and intelligence. Then she said, "I called you as soon as I realized this victim was Canadian. When I saw she might be connected to the Canadian mob, I knew you'd be interested. It looks like you get all the homicides in parks. Now, they could be a convenient place to kill someone. What about the second victim? Is he a Canadian as well?" "No, he's a local thug named Anthony Chichi. He has half a dozen arrests for assault and is the suspect in 2 homicides. He's known as an enforcer and a bodyguard for hire." I said, "So what have you figured out so far?" "The woman, Alicia Toussaint, was shot one time just above her nose. The bullet never exited. The medical examiner's people took both the bodies about 20 minutes ago. I was just trying to line up where the shot was probably taken from. There's a spent casing over there." She pointed to the edge of the concrete. "Depending on the weapon the killer was using, I suspect whoever took the shot was standing about 10 feet away." "Same caliber as your murder near Bryant Park?" "It was a 9, but so are about 70 million others. If the killer is as professional as I think, I doubt we'll match up the slugs." I took a few seconds to scan the entire crime scene. Experience had taught me that you sometimes thought of a new angle when you just looked around. I said, "I don't think anyone wants to hear about a turf war here in the city. It sure looks like someone has got it in for Canadians, and my sources say it's one of the Mexican cartels. Well, I'll leave it up to you to look at the big picture. I just want to find the killer here and in Bryant Park." "Was the second victim also shot?" "No, he was killed up close. I suspect it was before Miss Toussaint was shot. Someone shoved a sharp-edged weapon up through his jaw and into his brain." Instantly, I realized the other connection to the murders in the city. I didn't need to take a look at the VICAP database to tell me what I already knew. I said to Cassie, "Would you call that sharp-edged weapon a stiletto?" She thought about it for a moment, then nodded. I said, "Then I can guarantee that these murders are connected to what I'm looking at."